What if I told you that for 1,000 years, we've all been enchanted by the fairy tales, the stories of knights in shining armor, of damsels in their towers, of a single, magical kiss that promises happily ever after? We picture a world of chivalry and romance, a time when love was pure and true. But that vision is a beautiful deception, a carefully constructed fantasy to mask a brutal, shocking reality. Imagine being a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. You are told that your heart, your body, and your entire future now belong to a man you have never met, a man whose name you've just learned. Your life is not your own to choose. It is a contract signed and sealed in a language you may not even understand. Your value isn't in your spirit or your mind. It's measured in acres of land, heads of cattle, and the political advantage your family gains. This was the lived reality for millions of women throughout the Middle Ages. For a millennium, an entire gender was systematically denied the most fundamental human right, the right to choose who they love. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on one of history's most guarded secrets. We will uncover the cold, calculated business of medieval marriage, a world where love was literally bought and sold. We'll meet the queens who ruled nations but couldn't rule their own hearts, the peasant girls who found a strange freedom in poverty, and the rebels who risked everything for a single moment of genuine connection. The story we are about to tell is not just about the past. It is a story that has shaped the very DNA of our modern relationships in ways you cannot begin to imagine. Get comfortable and step back in time with us, because what we are about to discover might just change how you see love and freedom forever. From the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, marriage had almost nothing to do with love. It was a transaction. It was pure business, colder and more calculated than any corporate merger on Wall Street today. A woman's romantic destiny was commodity, decided by three things: her father's ambitions, her family's wealth, and the strategic value of her womb. Love was a dangerous fantasy. It was a luxury reserved for poets and peasants, and even then, it was a secret whispered in the shadows, a fleeting warmth in a world of cold duty. The year is 1147, in the French countryside. A 12-year-old girl clutches a worn wooden doll. Her mother is braiding her hair. Marie doesn't know it yet, but this is the final morning of her childhood. She will be the wife of a powerful baron 3 times her age, a man whose face she saw for the first time only yesterday. Her dowry is what matters: 200 acres of fertile farmland, 50 sheep, and the promise of a military alliance that will protect her father's lands. They are completely irrelevant. They are a ghost at the feast. This was an unusual tragedy. This was simply how the world worked. Historical records from 12th century England reveal that over 90% of noble marriages were arranged before the bride was 16. But even that statistic hides a more heartbreaking truth. Many girls were betrothed while they were still infants, their future signed away in legal contracts thicker than a Bible. Imagine a baby, still nursing at her mother's breast, already bound by a contract that would dictate every intimate detail of her future. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the most important choice you have ever made about love. Maybe it was deciding to go on a first date, choosing your partner, or the moment you decided to marry. Now, imagine that choice being completely stolen from you. Imagine it being made by people who saw you not as a daughter, but as a walking, talking business opportunity. That feeling of absolute helplessness, that was the daily reality for millions of medieval women. And these were not simple handshake agreements. Medieval marriage contracts were legal masterpieces of control. They were meticulously drafted documents that specified not just who a woman would marry, but how many children she was expected to produce, what would happen if she failed to provide a male heir, and even how her very body would be used to secure and maintain family alliances. One horrifying contract, discovered in the Vatican archives and dated to 1203, literally includes a clause outlining the bride's breeding schedule. The contract stipulated the times of year she was expected to conceive to ensure the healthiest possible heirs. She was, in the eyes of the law and her own family. The deepest tragedy is that many of these women were brilliant, educated, and fiercely capable. They were trained to run vast estates, manage complex finances, and make decisions that affected the lives of hundreds. The one decision that was truly their own, the choice of a partner, was the one they were never allowed to make. This was the gilded cage of the medieval noblewoman. She had everything a person could want, except the one thing that mattered most: the freedom to love. There is no story that captures this paradox more perfectly than that of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her name echoes through history as one of the most powerful women who ever lived. She was a queen of two countries, a leader of a crusade, a woman who controlled more land than the King of France himself. She was a force of nature. She was a prisoner of her own power. The year is 1137. Eleanor is just 15 years old, but she has just inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, wealthy territory in what is now modern-day France. She is brilliant, educated, and speaks multiple languages. She is one of an elite handful of the most powerful people in all of Europe. Within months of her father's death, she finds herself standing at an altar, marrying Louis VII, the future King of France. Not because she chose him, not because she loved him, but because a room full of men, her advisors and guardians, decided it was the most politically advantageous move. Eleanor wasn't even permitted to attend her own wedding negotiations. While she was grieving the loss of her father, her life was being carved up and distributed like pieces on a chessboard. The actual marriage contract, which still exists today in the French National Archives, is a chilling document. It is 47 pages long. It meticulously lists her territories, her expected duties as queen, and her absolute obligation to produce male heirs. It even has specifications about her appearance at court functions. They are not mentioned once. But Eleanor's story gets even more dramatic. After 15 years in a passionless marriage to a man she later described as more monk than king, she achieved the impossible. She managed to get their marriage annulled. For one brief, shining moment, at 30 years old, she was once again the independent ruler of Aquitaine, in control of her vast wealth and her own destiny. What happened next is the most telling detail of all. Within 8 weeks, just 8 weeks, this time to Henry II of England, a man 11 years her junior. Perhaps this time it was for love. The brutal truth is that Eleanor had no choice. As an unmarried woman controlling that much land, she was seen as a dangerous instability in the fragile political landscape of Europe. Kings, nobles, and church leaders were literally lining up to force her into another marriage. A woman with that much power simply could not be allowed to remain independent. This is where the story becomes a true tragedy. We have surviving letters that passed between Eleanor and Henry before their marriage. They reveal two brilliant, ambitious, and powerful minds connecting, intellectual sparring, and even something we might recognize as flirtation. It seems that against all odds, they did develop genuine feelings for one another. But even when a medieval woman was lucky enough to find a spark of love, it was still happening within a system that treated her as property. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, including 2 future kings of England, Richard the Lionheart and King John. But their relationship eventually soured and turned into a bitter political rivalry. Eleanor began supporting her sons in rebellions against their own father. She did this not out of simple spite, but because she realized that even as a queen, she had no real power to protect her children's futures within the patriarchal system. Henry's response was swift and brutal. He imprisoned his own wife for 16 years. 16 years of her life were stolen from her, locked away in a castle, because she dared to act as a political agent independent of her husband. This woman had ruled territories. She had personally led knights on a crusade. She had been the crowned queen of 2 of Europe's most powerful nations. But the moment she stepped outside the narrow road defined for her as a wife and mother, she lost everything. And this was the most powerful woman. Imagine what happened to women with less status, less wealth, and less protection. Her story was not unique. The daughter of King Henry I of England was named as the rightful heir to the English throne. Her father made all of his nobles swear an oath to support her claim. But when he died, what happened? The nobles immediately broke their sacred oath and crowned her male cousin, Stephen. A woman could not rule in her own right. Matilda was forced to fight a brutal 19-year civil war just to claim what was legally hers. This was the twisted logic of medieval nobility. Women were raised to be intelligent, educated, and capable. Eleanor spoke 6 languages and could negotiate international treaties. When it came to choosing a husband, she was suddenly considered too emotional, too irrational to make a sound choice. It was a system designed to use their minds, but to deny their hearts completely. But there was another power, an even greater force, that held the hearts of medieval women. It was an institution that claimed to speak for God himself, yet created rules about love that seemed designed by the devil. The medieval Catholic Church didn't just influence marriage, it controlled every single aspect of it. And what it did to women's romantic freedom was perhaps the most systematic and psychologically damaging oppression. Here's a fact that should stagger you. The laws that govern marriage across all of medieval Europe, known as canon law, were written almost entirely by celibate men. They were written by priests, bishops, and popes who had taken vows never to experience romantic love or physical intimacy themselves. Think about that profound irony. The very men who had removed themselves from the game of love were the ones writing the rule book for everyone else, and especially for women. Let's step inside a confessional in the year a 20-year-old woman, let's call her Agnes, is kneeling in the dark. She has confessed a feeling a powerful desire for the blacksmith's apprentice, a young man her father has forbidden her to see. But the priest doesn't just tell her this feeling is sinful. According to official church doctrine, he is required to interrogate her. He must ask about the exact nature of her feelings, the specific thoughts she's had, whether she has fantasized about him, even whether she has touched herself while thinking of him. The church had created an entire, intricate taxonomy of female desire, and every single category was a sin. To have romantic feelings for someone other than your husband was adultery of the heart. To feel physical attraction before marriage was the sin of lust. To want to choose your own partner was a sin of pride and disobedience. It gets even more twisted. Even feeling genuine, passionate love for your own husband could be considered problematic. One of the most influential church fathers, Saint Jerome, literally wrote that a man who loves his wife too passionately is an adulterer. You could commit adultery with your own wife. This created an impossible psychological trap. Women were taught that marriage was their sacred duty and highest calling, but that enjoying the physical aspect of that marriage was inherently sinful. They were expected to produce children, but any pleasure taken in the act of conception was a source of shame. They were supposed to love their husbands, but not too much, lest that earthly love distract from their love for God. It was like being commanded to walk while being forbidden to move your feet. And the church's control was not just theoretical, it was absolute legal power. Getting a divorce, or an annulment as they called it, was virtually impossible. The statistics are mind-blowing. Over a period of 400 years between 1100 and 1500, church courts granted exactly 47 annulments in an entire country over 4 centuries. For an ordinary woman, escaping an abusive or loveless marriage was not just difficult, it was a statistical impossibility. The church justified this cruelty by teaching that suffering within a marriage was spiritually beneficial. It was a way to purify your soul for the afterlife. The foundational text of church marriage law, a document from the 1140s called Gratian's Decretum, states that a wife cannot refuse sexual relations with her husband under any circumstances, because her body legally belongs to him. If she enjoys those relations too much, she is guilty of the sin of lust. It was a system designed to ensure that women could never, ever win. And what was the only escape route from this system? For some, it was a convent, but this escape was not free. Entering a convent required a substantial dowry. Poor women couldn't even afford to become nuns. The church had literally put a price tag on spiritual freedom. Found in the Vatican secret archives, was written by a nun named Sister Margarita in 1298. You ask if I am happy here, free from being sold to a man, free from bearing children until my body breaks, free from pretending that my own desires do not exist. If this is God's will, then God has been kinder to me than my father ever was. The church's most insidious tactic was how it redefined love itself. It taught that earthly love, passionate, romantic, physical love, was always inferior to divine love. This created a hierarchy of emotion that constantly told women their most natural human desires were base, animalistic, and unworthy. Acceptable form of love was a sanitized, desexualized, and completely controlled version approved by the male clergy. For 1,000 years, the church held the keys to women's hearts, and it kept them locked away. But what about the vast majority of the population? What about the peasants, the farmers, the laborers who made up over 90% of medieval society? Their lives were different. Away from the cold calculations of noble courts, they must have been free to love. The truth is far more complex, and in some ways, even more surprising. A strange paradox existed. While their noble sisters were trapped in gilded cages, peasant women lived in a world where poverty created its own brutal set of rules. But within those harsh realities, they sometimes found an unexpected freedom that a duchess could only dream of. Meet Sarah, a miller's daughter in a small English village in 1347. Unlike Eleanor of Aquitaine, Sarah owns nothing. No land, no title, no political value. Her life is one of relentless, back-breaking labor. But here's the fascinating twist. Sarah might actually have more say in who she marries than the wealthiest noble woman in Europe. Historians call it the poverty paradox. When you have nothing to inherit, there is nothing to protect through a strategic marriage. Peasant families couldn't afford the luxury of marrying for political alliances because they had no political power to leverage. This meant that often, the choice of a partner was left to the young people themselves. We must not romanticize this freedom. It was a freedom born of desperation, and it came with its own devastating set of constraints. The average peasant woman married between the ages of 14 and 16. She would likely give birth to her first child within a year, and would face a terrifying 1 in 4 chance of dying in childbirth at some point in her life. If she survived, she could expect to be pregnant almost continuously until menopause or death, whichever came first. And her choices were incredibly limited. Imagine your entire dating pool consisted of the 20 or so eligible men who lived within walking distance of your home, and half of them were your cousins. Medieval villages were so small and isolated that finding someone you could love who wasn't a close relative was a genuine challenge. Unlike noble women, who were at least protected in theory by legal contracts, peasant women had virtually no legal protection from abuse. A husband could beat his wife with complete impunity. The church even taught that this was his right and his duty, a correction, to guide his wife toward virtue. There was a crucial difference in the structure of their lives. Peasant women worked. They worked alongside men in the fields. They tended animals. They ran market stalls. This economic partnership sometimes translated into more egalitarian relationships. We have records of peasant couples making business decisions together, saving money together, building a life together as true partners in survival. A peasant man literally could not survive without his wife's labor. This created a different kind of power dynamic. It wasn't equality, but it was a profound interdependence. A peasant woman wasn't a decorative political asset. She was an essential economic one. We must be clear, this did not make her independent. She was still legally the property of her husband. The difference was that her labor was too valuable for her to be completely dominated or cast aside. She was like a vital piece of farm equipment, essential but still owned. And in their small, tight-knit communities, peasant women developed remarkable networks of mutual support that were often denied to noble women isolated in their castles. Village midwives, wise women, and herbalists created an informal system of they helped each other through childbirth, they shared remedies, they offered comfort in times of grief, and they supported each other through domestic troubles, all completely outside the control of the official church or legal structures. The peasant woman's experience of love was a study in contradictions. She may have had the freedom to choose her partner, but that choice was made from a tiny pool of options and was framed by a life of brutal hardship. She was a partner in labor, but not an equal in law. She could experience genuine affection and companionship, but always under the shadow of incredible poverty and physical vulnerability. Love, for her, was not a grand romance. It was a small, flickering candle in a vast and unforgiving darkness. So if marriage was a loveless contract for the rich and a partnership of pure survival for the poor, where do all of our romantic notions of Middle Ages come from? The answer lies in one of the most bizarre and psychologically complex inventions in the history of romance, the idea of courtly love. Here is the mind-bending irony at the heart of the medieval world. The very same society that treated women as breeding stock and business assets also created some of the most passionate and beautiful romantic literature the world has ever known. Knights wrote sonnets that could make you weep. Troubadours composed songs that could melt the coldest heart. But here is the crucial, none of it was about their wives. Courtly love was a game, an elaborate, elegant, and emotionally torturous game with a very specific set of rules. And the first rule of courtly love was that it had to exist outside of marriage. The leading writers on the subject argued that true love could not exist between a husband and a wife. Think about how insane this was for the women trapped inside the system. You are a noble woman, married off at 15 to a grumpy old duke for political reasons. You are trapped in a loveless existence. One day, a handsome young knight at your husband's court dedicates himself to you. He starts writing you the most beautiful poetry you've ever read. He wears your colors in the tournament. He performs great deeds in your name and declares to the whole world that you are the source of all his inspiration, the ideal of beauty and virtue. He asks for nothing in return, at least not physically. The lady are expected to remain forever pure and unattainable. You graciously accept his worship from afar, but you can never, ever consummate the relationship. It must have been simultaneously thrilling and agonizing. To finally receive the romantic attention and adoration you have been starved of your entire life, but to know that it is all a fantasy, a beautiful performance that can never become real without destroying you both. This was a system that literally romanticized emotional starvation. It created a pressure valve for a society that was suffocating under its own romantic repression. Instead of changing the system of loveless arranged marriages, they created an elaborate fantasy world where real love could exist as a separate, unattainable dream. It was like treating the symptoms of a disease while carefully preserving the disease itself. The great love stories that have come down to us from this period are almost all stories of adulterous, impossible love. The most famous of all, the tale of Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, is the ultimate courtly love tragedy. He is the greatest knight in the world, devoted to his best friend and king. She is the beautiful queen. Their love for each other is passionate, pure, and profound, and it destroys the entire kingdom. The message was clear. The only true love is love that is forbidden, adulterous, and ultimately catastrophic. And when these courtly fantasies did spill over into reality, the consequences were devastating. The famous 12th century affair between the philosopher Peter Abelard and his brilliant student Heloise began as a classic teacher-student infatuation, full of intellectual and emotional devotion. But when their relationship became physical and she became pregnant, the medieval world lost its collective mind. Heloise's furious uncle had Abelard attacked and brutally castrated. Heloise was forced to hide herself away in a convent for the rest of her life. Their surviving letters, written to each other decades later, are some of the most heartbreaking and passionate documents in all of human history. They are a testament to a powerful love that was destroyed by a society that had no place for it. Courtly love, in the end, was the system's most brilliant and cruel defense mechanism. It trained women to be grateful for mere scraps of romantic attention. It taught them to settle for symbolic love instead of demanding the real thing. It was a beautiful lie, a golden fantasy painted on the bars of a cage. But not every woman was content to live within the cage. Across the centuries, in the face of overwhelming power, some women chose to rebel. They refused to be pawns in their fathers' games or property of their husbands. Their stories are not fairy tales. They are stories of incredible courage, of daring defiance, and of women who risked everything for the revolutionary idea that they should be the authors of their own lives. In 1152, a 16-year-old girl named Christina of Marquiate did something unthinkable. She was betrothed to a nobleman she despised. Instead of accepting her fate, not to another man, not to a convent, she disguised herself as a man, lived as a hermit in a cave for 4 years, and survived on food secretly brought to her by sympathetic peasants. This teenage girl chose to live like a wild animal rather than marry a man, and in the end, her family eventually gave up their search. Then there was Isabella of France, the she-wolf, married to the English King Edward II at just 12 years old. She endured a humiliating marriage to a man who openly preferred the company of his male favorites. But Isabella did not suffer in silence. She fell in love with an exiled nobleman named Roger Mortimer, and she wasn't content with a secret affair. They raised an army, deposed her husband from the throne, and ruled the country as lovers and partners for 4 years. A medieval queen launched a successful military coup, all because she wanted to choose her own partner. Some rebellions were spiritual. A French mystic named Marguerite Porete wrote a book in the year 1300 called A Mirror of Simple Souls. She made a radical argument that a soul, and specifically a woman's soul, could connect directly with God without needing a priest, a bishop, or a husband to act as a middleman. The church understood the dangerous implication. If women didn't need men to interpret God's will, then they didn't need men to tell them who to marry or how to love. The church demanded she recant. And for that idea, for that act of spiritual rebellion, they burned her at the stake. These individual acts of defiance, often brutally punished, began to create tiny cracks in the monolithic walls of the system. But the greatest force for change would come not from a single rebellion, but from a slow, grinding transformation that would reshape the very fabric of society. It began with the rise of a new class of people. In bustling cities like Florence and Venice, a new kind of marriage began to emerge. These were not based on ancient titles or vast tract of land, but on active business partnership. A merchant's wife was often his bookkeeper, his business manager, and his trusted partner. And as women became more economically valuable, their status within marriage began to shift. We have the letters of a merchant's wife named Marguerite de Taigny from the late 1300s. She and her husband argue about money and business, but they argue as equals. Theirs is a partnership of minds as well as fortunes. Then came the catastrophe. In the mid-1300s, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing nearly half the population. It was an unimaginable horror, but it had a shocking and unforeseen consequence. There was a massive labor shortage. Was far more valuable. Women took over businesses, managed farms, and entered guilds that had previously been closed to them. This newfound economic power gave them leverage they had never had before. For the first time, large numbers of women had a viable alternative to marriage for survival. The invention of the printing press in the 1400s was like dynamite. Ideas could now spread faster than any authority could suppress them. Stories of rebellious women, arguments for love and choice, and translations of texts from other cultures where women had more freedom. All of this began to circulate, planting seeds of dissent in the minds of thousands. The world began to change. The pressure from these economic, social, and technological shifts, combined with the unyielding spirit of female resistance, finally began to break the old system apart. The age of marriage as a pure transaction was beginning to die. The age of marriage based on choice, on companionship, and on love was struggling to be born. Looking around our world today, it is tempting to think that we have completely escaped the shadow of this history. We live in a world of romantic comedies, dating apps, and the freedom to choose our own partners. We believe in love. The battles of those medieval women seem distant, relics of a dark and unenlightened past. But have we truly escaped? Or are the ghosts of the medieval world still with us, hiding in plain sight, shaping our modern relationships in ways we fail to see? Think about the traditional wedding ceremony. When a father gives away his daughter at the altar, we see it as a touching tradition, but it is a direct echo of a medieval property transfer. The moment a woman's legal ownership was passed from her father to her husband, a direct legacy of the medieval obsession with a bride's virginity as a measure of her value. The economic echoes are just as powerful. The persistent wage gap between men and women has deep roots in the medieval idea that a man's work provides for a family, while a woman's work is merely supplementary. The motherhood penalty, where a woman's career and earnings suffer after having children, is the modern ghost of the medieval belief that a woman's primary value is reproductive. Even our most intimate feelings are influenced by these ancient ideas. The cultural double standard that often celebrates male sexual experience while shaming female desire is a direct descendant of the medieval church's teaching that female lust was more dangerous and corrupting than that of men. For centuries, the legal systems of Europe and America were built on a medieval foundation that gave a husband nearly absolute authority over his wife. It was not until the late 20th century that marital rape was finally recognized as a crime in all 50 United States. The law operated on the medieval principle that upon marriage, a wife gave irrevocable consent. Her body was no longer her own. The medieval world is not as far away as we think. Its ideas are embedded in our traditions, our laws, our economy, and our psychology. But the most important legacy of these medieval women is not the oppression they faced. It is the story of their resistance. It is the proof that even in the face of a system designed to crush the human spirit, the desire for love, dignity, and freedom is unconquerable. The freedoms we have today were not given to us. They were seized. They were fought for generation after generation by women who dared say no, by the girl who ran away to the woods, by the queen who led an army, by the nun who chose freedom over marriage, by the merchant's wife who demanded to be treated as a partner, and by the millions of forgotten women who simply tried to carve out a small space of happiness in a world that denied them. Their struggle is a powerful reminder that progress is not inevitable. It is the result of conscious choices and courageous actions, and the fight is not over. In many parts of the world today, women still face arranged marriages, child marriage, and violence for defying patriarchal control. Even in the most progressive societies, the subtle echoes of these old battles remain. The story of medieval women's fight for romantic freedom is, in the end, the story of how our modern idea of love was born. It wasn't born in a fairy tale castle. It was forged in the fire of oppression and won through centuries of silent struggle and daring rebellion. It is a legacy of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to demand its own truth, and it is a freedom that we must never, ever take for granted.